The most disconcerting discovery that Rudolf Steiner presented when investigating cases of people who described a persistent feeling of profound exhaustion that had existed as long as they could remember, and that did not improve significantly with adequate sleep or extended periods of complete rest, had nothing to do with biochemical deficiencies or physical organ dysfunction. As conventional doctors always obsessively searched through endless batteries of tests that invariably returned normal. Results: frustrating both patients and professionals who could not explain real symptoms using only materialistic models of causality, but was rooted in the revolutionary understanding that the human being was not just a physical body mysteriously animated by biological processes spontaneously emerging from dead matter, but was a complex entity composed of multiple layers or interpenetrating bodies operating simultaneously at different frequencies of reality. Dense physical body that was the only aspect recognized by materialistic science, etheric or vital body composed of formative forces that organized life processes, maintaining coherence of form through constant flow of substances that entered and left without destroying the organizational pattern characteristic of a living organism, body, astral, emotional, and sensory consciousness that animals shared with humans, but that plants did not possess because they did not have a nervous system allowing subjective experiences. And finally, a higher self or immortal spirit that was the core of individuality, persisting through multiple incarnations, accumulating experiences and developing capabilities throughout an extensive cycle of rebirths that did not begin with current birth nor end with future death, but which was a journey crossing millennia of conscientious evolution. According to this anthroposophical cosmology that Steiner developed through decades of systematic clairvoyant investigation of supersensible dimensions of reality, inexplicable exhaustion that did not respond to physical treatments because it did not originate primarily from dysfunctions on a material level, but was a manifestation in the physical body of imbalances or blockages operating in subtle bodies, especially in the etheric body that was responsible for the vitalization of the physical. Organism through mediating the flow of life forces from spiritual dimensions for expression in measurable biological processes. When the etheric body was functioning optimally without blockages or distortions, the person experienced abundant vitality, feeling energized and able to engage in physical and mental activities with enthusiasm without quickly depleting itself. But when the etheric body was compromised through karmic imprints carried over from previous lives or through traumas of birth or pregnancy that created problematic patterns in the organization of life forces, the person experienced chronic depletion, even when the physical body was apparently healthy by all measurable criteria, because the problem was not in material organs, but in invisible patterns of vital energy that could not be detected by physical instruments, but that were absolutely real in their effects on functional capacity and quality of lived experience. The concept of the etheric body that was central to Steiner's understanding of vital exhaustion was not arbitrary invention, nor was it baseless metaphysical speculation, but was direct observation of a dimension of reality that became perceptible when consciousness was trained through specific practices of meditation and concentration to operate at frequencies more subtle than ordinary sensory perception, which was limited to registering only denser vibrations corresponding to solid physical matter. Steiner described the etheric body as being composed of 4 types of ethers or formative forces that corresponded to the 4 elements of the esoteric tradition, but understood not as material substances, but as qualities or modes of organization of energy. Heat ether, which was related to expansion and with processes of dissolution, allowing rigid forms to be softened and transformed. Light ether, which created forms, and which was related to processes of crystallization and consolidation, giving defined structure to organisms. Chemical or sonic ether, which it mediated processes of combination and separation, allowing substances to interact through chemical affinities, and life ether that supported reproduction and growth, allowing organisms to perpetuate themselves through generations. These 4 ethers did not operate in isolation, but in dynamic balance, where organismal health depended on correct proportions and harmonious flows between different types of etheric forces, and when balance was disturbed through karmic impressions or through external influences that taxed the body's capacity. And to maintain harmony, symptoms of illness or exhaustion emerged as signs that restoration of balance was necessary. A person who was born with etheric patterns already unbalanced due to karma brought from previous lives experienced from the beginning of life the feeling that vital forces were not flowing properly, leaving them constantly depleted even when they had done nothing to justify exhaustion according to the logic of cause and effect operating only on a physical level. And this discrepancy between the absence of obvious physical causes and the presence of very real symptoms created confusion both for the person and for medical professionals who were trying to help but who were limited by paradigms that did not recognize the existence of causal dimensions. operating beyond measurable materiality. The specific origin of unbalanced etheric patterns that manifested as natal exhaustion was, according to Steiner, often related to how the soul had lived in previous incarnations, and especially to patterns of vital energy use that had been established through repeated choices over multiple lifetimes, creating deeply ingrained tendencies that were then carried as predispositions into the etheric body of the new incarnation. The first important category of karmic causes of exhaustion were lives where the person had systematically abused one's own vital forces through compulsive work without allowing adequate periods of recovery, using stimulating substances to push the body beyond natural limits, or living in a constant state of tension and urgency without ever truly relaxing, allowing natural regenerative processes to operate restoring balance. When these patterns were maintained over years or decades in a previous life, impressions were etched deeply into the etheric body, creating a tendency to continue operating according to the same patterns of tension and depletion, even in new life, where consciously a person could want to live differently, but where etheric patterns inherited from the past continued to influence organism functioning at levels that were below conscious will control. Second category were lives where the person had lived in ways that profoundly violated natural rhythms of day and night, seasons, and lunar cycles that were fundamental to maintaining healthy etheric body that was intrinsically connected to larger cosmic rhythms, and that, when forced to operate against these rhythms through life choices that completely ignored needs for synchronization with natural cycles, developed distortions that were then carried as vulnerabilities in subsequent incarnations, manifesting as inability to regenerate adequately, even when a person tried to respect natural rhythms, because damage at etheric levels was so profound that it required specific therapeutic work to correct, rather than simply improving automatically through changing external habits. Third particularly significant category were lives, where a person had systematically exploited energy from others through vampiric relationships, where constantly took emotional support, attention, care, without adequate reciprocity, draining vitality from others to sustain own functioning without developing capacity to generate energy internally through connection with authentic spiritual sources. When soul, who had operated in this way, parasitically in previous life incarnated again, often experienced karmic reversal, where now it was she who felt constantly drained as if others were drawing energy, even when objectively this was not happening, because the karmic impression of having drained others created an etheric pattern where life forces were constantly leaking as if they were still being given to others even when one was alone. And this chronic leakage of energy through holes in the etheric structure that were marks of past karma created a persistent feeling of exhaustion that had no identifiable present cause, but was the effect of causes operating in the distant past. The fourth category that Steiner often identified in cases of natal exhaustion were lives where the person had completely denied spiritual dimensions of existence by living in absolute materialism, identifying fully with the physical body and with the temporal personality without recognizing that he was in essence an immortal spiritual being, temporarily inhabiting a material vehicle for developmental purposes. This extreme materialism creates severe disconnection between the higher spiritual self and the lower vehicles of expression, because the person consciously cut off through philosophical denial or through a lifestyle completely focused on immediate material gratifications, any opening for influx of spiritual forces that they were the ultimate source of all life, genuine suchness. And when a soul that had lived in this way incarnated again, often found that connection to spiritual sources of energy was damaged, requiring conscious work to rebuild bridges that had been burned through. Prolonged denial in previous existences. Fifth category was lives marked by severe trauma, especially traumas of violent or premature death that left deep impressions on the etheric body, creating areas of contraction and blockage where energy did not flow freely, because memory of trauma, even if not accessible, current consciousness was recorded on etheric and astral levels, creating defensive patterns of containment that had been appropriate at the time of trauma to protect organism integrity, but which, when chronically maintained through being carried into new life, became obstacles to the healthy flow of vital forces that required opening and relaxation instead of tension and closure, that were responses to threats that no longer existed but continued to be held in etheric bodily memory. The crucial question of why some people were born with exhaustion while others were born with abundant vitality was not a matter of random luck, nor was it evidence of cosmic injustice distributing conditions unequally for no comprehensible reason, but reflected differences in the karmic histories of individual souls who had lived different numbers of incarnations and who had made different choices in previous lives, creating correspondingly different consequences that now had to be worked through in the current life. Furthermore, Steiner emphasized that challenging conditions, including natal exhaustion, were not necessarily punishments for past mistakes, as popular interpretations of karma often assumed, but were educational opportunities structured precisely to develop capacities and qualities that had been lacking in previous lives and that were necessary for continued soul evolution. A person born exhausted was being offered the opportunity to learn specific lessons that could not be learned in conditions of abundant vitality, where the person would never be forced to develop discrimination about energy use, would never learn to listen to the body's subtle signals indicating needs, never would cultivate patience and acceptance of limitations, never develop deep compassion for one's own vulnerability, which would then extend to the vulnerability of others. These lessons that were often ignored or avoided when conditions were easy became inevitable when one was forced through limitations imposed by chronic exhaustion to confront fundamental questions about how to live meaningfully within severe constraints of available energy, and the work of learning these lessons consciously rather than merely suffering through the condition passively was precisely what transformed adversity into an opportunity for development that would serve the soul not only in the current life, but in full cycles of future incarnations, where capabilities developed through working with current limitations would be carried forward as valuable resources. The fundamental difference between ordinary tiredness that everyone experiences occasionally and the existential exhaustion that a person with heavy karma constantly carries was in the depth of levels where depletion operated and in the nature of causes that produced it. Ordinary physical fatigue resulted from prolonged bodily exertion that depleted the biochemical resources of muscles and organs, but was completely restored through adequate sleep, allowing natural regenerative processes to operate by replenishing energy stores and repairing minor tissue damage. This form of fatigue was a normal and healthy part of the cycle of activity and recovery that all living organisms went through and which did not indicate anything problematic other than a natural need for alternating periods of exertion and rest. Existential exhaustion, on the other hand, had roots not in depletion of physical resources, but in blockages of the flow of vital forces at the level of the etheric body that were not restored through sleep. Because sleep repaired only the physical body, but did not dissolve karmic impressions nor correct distortions in etheric patterns that were real causes of problems. A person could sleep 10 or 12 hours, waking up still feeling exhausted, because sleep did not address levels where the problem originated. They could rest for weeks or months without activities strenuous, but still feel a constant weight of fatigue because the causes were not in excess of present activity, but in patterns inherited from the karmic past that continue to operate regardless of how much the person rested in the present. This distinction between tiredness, that was a natural response to present effort, and that was resolved through present rest, versus exhaustion, that was a manifestation of conditions operating in and levels and times that transcended current life, and that therefore could not be resolved through conventional solutions focused only on optimizing physical functions. It was absolutely crucial to understand why materialistic medical approaches consistently failed to provide significant relief to people suffering from the condition. Doctors looked for causes only in measurable material dimensions, and when they found no abnormalities in tests, they concluded that the problem was psychological or imaginary, dismissing the genuine experience of suffering that the person was trying to communicate, but that did not fit into diagnostic categories that recognized only conditions that could be objectified through instrumental measurements of physical processes. The importance of understanding that this is not tiredness in the ordinary sense, but was a manifestation of spiritual conditions operating through the etheric body, was in freeing one from the guilt and self-judgment that often accompanied inexplicable exhaustion when it was interpreted as evidence of laziness, weakness of character, or lack of discipline, when in fact it was the result of factors completely beyond conscious control of current will operating from karmic and etheric levels that could not simply be overcome through greater effort, nor through more positive mental attitudes, such as ideologies of simplistic self-help often suggested. When a person understood that the exhaustion they carried had legitimate roots in soul history and in etheric patterns inherited from previous lives, they could stop judging themselves as inadequate by comparing themselves to others who had more energy, because they were comparing incomparable situations. Others did not carry the same karmic weights, nor had the same distortions in the etheric body, and therefore had much more abundant vital resources, not because they were morally superior, nor because they were doing something better, but simply because they were at different stages of the evolutionary journey with different lessons to be learned, and with different karma to be worked on. This understanding freed one from the vicious cycle of self-flagellation, where one judged oneself for not being able to do what others did easily, and then wasted precious energy on feelings of inadequacy and shame that only deepened depletion rather than contributed to restoration, instead allowing one to focus the limited energy one had on working constructively with the condition through practices that addressed causes at the levels where they operated, rather than trying to force through. Limitations, creating even more severe breakdowns that were counterproductive. The therapeutic methods that Steiner developed specifically for working with exhaustion, rooted in etheric body disorders, were radically different from conventional approaches, because they directly addressed causal levels rather than merely suppressing physical symptoms through medications that did not touch problem roots. Eurythmy, which was the art of movement developed by Steiner, was particularly effective in reorganizing etheric patterns through specific gestures that corresponded to sounds and formative forces operating in etheric body construction. When a person performed eurythmic movements designed therapeutically for a specific condition, he was literally resculpting patterns of vital energy flow through the body, dissolving blockages and restoring harmonies that had been disturbed, and effects were not merely placebo, nor were they generic benefits of any form of movement, but were specific results of working directly with etheric forces through gestures that had been precisely calibrated through clairvoyant investigation to produce desired transformations in invisible organizations of vital energy. Anthroposophical medicine that Steiner developed in collaboration with physician Ida Wegman used substances prepared according to principles that took into account not only chemical composition, but also spiritual qualities and processes through which substances were extracted from the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. Metal preparations were used to work with vitalization processes, because metals had specific affinities with different organs and systems, and when prepared appropriately, through dilutions and potentiations, could stimulate regenerative processes at etheric levels that then manifested as improvements in physical functioning. Plant preparations were selected based on an understanding of how different species embodied specific balances of etheric forces that could then be transferred to the human body through ingestion or external application to help restore imbalances. Preparations of animal substances were used judiciously to work with astral body processes. That also influenced vitality through connections between emotions and vital energy that were ignored by conventional medicine, but were recognized by anthroposophy as fundamental to the integral health of a complete human being, operating simultaneously on multiple levels. Artistic therapies, including painting, clay modeling, music, and speech, were also essential components of the anthroposophic therapeutic approach to exhaustion, because engagement with artistic processes worked directly with formative forces that were identical to the forces that organize the etheric body. When a person painted with watercolors, using specific techniques of letting colors flow and interact freely on damp paper rather than rigidly controlling them through contours, they were experiencing and participating in processes of fluidity and transformation that were characteristic of a healthy etheric body, and were simultaneously exercising on a soul level the ability to release excessive control that was often part of patterns that contributed to etheric blockages. When modeling clay, I was working with forces of condensation and expansion that corresponded to polarities of ethers of light and heat, learning through direct tactile experience how to find balances between opposing tendencies. When I sang or spoke rhythmically, I was harmonizing the etheric body through sound vibrations that had direct effects on reorganization of patterns, because sound was a manifestation of chemical ether that mediated connection and separation processes. These art therapies were not entertainment, nor were they merely generic relaxation, but were precise therapeutic interventions working by actively engaging the person in creative processes that mirrored and influenced vital processes operating at etheric levels, restoring capabilities that had been compromised through karma or trauma. Meditative and contemplative practices that Steiner prescribed as an essential component of therapeutic work with exhaustion were designed specifically to strengthen connection between higher spiritual self and lower vehicles of expression, allowing spiritual forces to flow more freely for manifestation in the etheric and physical body, restoring vitality that was depleted not because of a lack of spiritual resources that were inexhaustible, but because of blockages that prevented resources from reaching levels where they were needed. Morning meditations focused on cultivating gratitude for gifts of existence and consciously connecting with spiritual purposes of incarnation helped to open channels through which energy could flow from spiritual source to physical manifestation. Afternoon retrospectives, reviewing the day's events in reverse order and observing patterns of reactions without judgment, helped develop conscious self-observation that was necessary to recognize where energy was being wasted through automatic reactions and where conscious shifts in patterns could release resources that were being blocked, concentrations in images or ideas. Specific actions developed willpower that was needed to implement changes that insights revealed were necessary, but that would not happen automatically without deliberately cultivating the ability to direct attention and action according to understandings rather than habitual impulses. These practices, when performed disciplinedly over months and years, gradually transformed etheric and astral body organization, creating healthier patterns that then manifested as progressive increases in available vitality, not through suppressing symptoms, but through transforming causes at the levels where they operated, allowing genuine healing to occur rather than just palliative management of chronic condition. The deeper dimension of working with natal exhaustion from an anthroposophic perspective was recognizing that the condition was not merely a problem to be resolved through returning to a normal state of functioning, but was an opportunity for development that, when worked on consciously, could lead to capabilities and understandings that transcended what would be possible in life without significant challenges. A person forced to live with severe limitations on available energy necessarily developed sensibilities and insights that a person with abundant vitality would never be motivated to cultivate. They learned to distinguish between activities that genuinely nourished the soul and activities that merely consumed energy without returning corresponding meaning. They developed the ability to say no to external demands that were not aligned with authentic purposes because they could not afford to no. Disperse limited forces in directions that did not serve essential evolution. They cultivated patience and acceptance of their own rhythms, rather than trying to force themselves to conform to social expectations about what constituted a productive or successful life, and especially developed deep compassion for both one's own vulnerabilities and the suffering of others who also struggled with challenging conditions that were invisible to outside observers, but that were absolutely real in the lived experience of the people who carried them. These capabilities that were developed through necessity in a context of limitation were not minor consolations for having to live with challenges, but were genuine achievements of the soul that would be carried as resources in future lives, where they would continue to be valuable, allowing a person to serve others more effectively through wisdom, gained through direct experience of having gone through difficulties with awareness and integrity instead of just having suffered passively through conditions without extracting the learnings that were offered. The final promise that Steiner's revelation offered to people born exhausted was not an instantaneous miracle cure that would magically eliminate all difficulties and restore abundant vitality without the need for self-work, but it was an understanding that transformed a relationship with a condition from meaningless adversity to be merely endured, to a significant opportunity for development to be actively worked through conscious engagement with the lessons that the condition offered. Combined with specific therapeutic practices that addressed causes at the etheric and karmic levels where they operated, rather than merely treating symptoms at the same level, physical. This approach, which combined spiritual understanding of causes with practical interventions on multiple levels, physical through anthroposophic medicine, etheric through eurythmy and art therapies, astral through work with emotions and through rhythms of life harmonized with natural cycles, and spiritual through meditative practices, strengthening connection with higher self, offered genuine hope of progressive improvement over time through patient and persistent work that would not be quick or easy, but that would be possible because it was addressing the problem at levels where it actually existed rather than merely being there, suppressing superficial manifestations without touching roots that would continue to generate symptoms until they were transformed. The fundamental change that occurred when a person understood exhaustion through an anthroposophic lens was from feeling helpless, victim of a random condition without explanation or solution, to becoming an active participant in a healing process that, although long and challenging, was under one's own control through conscious choices to engage with therapeutic practices and with inner work of transforming patterns that had created the condition initially, and this shift from passivity to agency, even if it did not immediately eliminate symptoms, transformed a quality of experience from meaningless suffering to a journey of development with a clear purpose, where each step of progress was a genuine achievement of soul, rather than being merely random fluctuations of symptoms that came and went for no understandable reason. The deeper wisdom that emerged from working with Steiner's teachings on natal exhaustion was the recognition that the body was not a self-sufficient machine operating independently according to purely mechanical laws, but was an instrument through which spiritual being manifested itself in physical dimensions, and that, therefore, health and vitality depended fundamentally not only on the optimization of biological processes, but on the quality of connection between spirit and matter, mediated by intermediate etheric and astral bodies that were bridges, allowing spiritual forces to achieve material expression. When connection was flowing harmoniously without blockages, one experienced abundant vitality and robust health as natural manifestations of life forces emanating from an inexhaustible spiritual source. But when connection was blocked or distorted through karma, trauma, or through lifestyles that violated spiritual laws of healthy existence, depletion and illness emerged as signs that restoration of harmony was necessary. This understanding that vitality was not a property of the physical body that could be managed through purely material manipulations, but was the result of the proper flow of spiritual forces through subtle vehicles that had to be cared for through appropriate practices, was revolutionary because it shifted focus from treating symptoms to transforming causes, and from external management of conditions to inner development of capabilities, allowing a person to become progressively more self-sufficient in maintaining one's own health through understanding and working with spiritual laws that governed functioning of organism as an integrated totality, operating simultaneously on multiple levels that should all be addressed whether comprehensive healing should occur, rather than just partial suppression of more obvious symptoms, leaving untouched root causes to continue, or generating problems in different ways. The final invitation that Steiner offered through revealing spiritual causes of natal exhaustion was to recognize that a condition, although genuinely challenging and limiting, was not a permanent sentence condemning a person to a life of suffering without the possibility of improvement, but was a condition that could be progressively transformed through conscious work on multiple fronts simultaneously, addressing karma through living in ways that balanced past patterns rather than reinforcing them, working with the etheric body through specific therapies that dissolved blockages and restored harmonious flows of life forces, strengthening connection with spiritual higher self through meditative practices that open channels for influx of energy from an inexhaustible source, and especially through cultivating attitudes of patience, acceptance, and compassion that allowed working with limitations wisely instead of fighting them destructively, creating more tension and depletion. This was not exhaustion that rest resolved because it was a manifestation of conditions operating at levels and times that transcended current life, but it was existential exhaustion rooted in soul history that, when properly understood and consciously worked through, could be progressively transformed over years of dedicated practice, revealing that even more challenging conditions, when faced with awareness and with appropriate tools, could be traversed with dignity and could serve as catalysts for development that would not be possible in easier circumstances, where lessons would not be learned because the pressure necessary to force growth would not be present, and that suffering, when transformed through spiritual understanding and through conscious work, was not waste nor evidence of failure, but was an investment in soul development that would pay dividends not only in progressive relief of symptoms in current life, but in developed capabilities that would be carried as valuable resources in full cycle future incarnations, where wisdom gained through having worked with severe limitations would allow one to serve others more effectively through empathic understanding of challenges that could only come from direct experience of having gone through similar difficulties, emerging transformed rather than merely traumatized, because one had chosen to consciously engage with the process, rather than just passively suffering through it without extracting meanings and learnings that were offered through each challenge that life presented as an opportunity disguised as apparent adversity, that when seen through spiritual eyes revealed itself as exactly what the soul needed for the next step of evolution, even when the ego resisted and complained, preferring comfort to growth, that only came through being forced beyond established limits into unknown territory where new capabilities had to be developed because old ones were no longer suitable for challenges that were encountered. In more advanced stages of the evolutionary journey, that was the ultimate purpose of every incarnated existence according to cosmology, anthroposophical view, seeing physical life not as an end in itself, but as a school of spiritual development where each experience contributed to progressive education of the soul through millennia of successive incarnations, eventually leading to the complete mastery that was humanity's ultimate destiny, evolving towards the ability to consciously collaborate with higher cosmic intelligences and creative processes of the universe, manifesting divine potentials through individualized forms that were unique and irreplaceable, even while being parts of greater totality, transcending sum of components through emergent integration, creating new levels of organization and meaning that did not exist before, and that were permanent contributions to the evolution of the entire cosmos, benefiting from the development of each individual soul who worked patiently through specific challenges that were presented to him as precisely calibrated opportunities to develop particular capacities that were necessary not only for his own good, but in service of the collective good of all humanity, evolving together through eons of progressive transformation.